Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and the last of these scheduled Operation Avalanche Salerno shows. There are a couple more I'm still working on with guests who are got other commitments at the moment, but last of the scheduled ones. Anyway, joining me to talk about naval support at Salerno and probably lots of other things is Dr. Alexander Clarke, who has his own great YouTube channel, Naval History Live. Link below. If you're not subscribed to that, go ahead and get that done. And I'm going to bring him in now. Good evening, Alex. How are you today?
Always good, Paul. It's always fun to be here. I always love it when I get invited back and I go, oh, good. Right then. Make sure I'm really on my game because there'll be some really scary questions provided by your
We have got a good bunch.
They are always well informed about everything.
But they're not. The good thing about them is I don't think they're ever trying to trip people up. I know some channels where they're going out there trying to find some fault. They're just genuinely interested and want to know more, which is good.
I have the same with my own channel in that, and it's when I've done stuff with Drax's channel as well, because people are asking questions earnestly and they really want the answer. It makes me more worried because it makes me more want to make sure I'm giving them the correct information and I'm answering a question properly. Let's be honest, the people who are trying to trip me up, I just don't care. You can soon tell very quickly. In the moment, you just go, oh, you're just being like that. Okay, right, and I'll give you flippant answers all night. I can talk about aliens if you want to, because the other fun, and actually, what's gone live tonight on my channel is me going through and rating science fiction capital ships, comparing them to actual historical capital ships.
Nice.
And putting them on the same rating system. Because occasionally I do that on my channel just because, well, it's my channel. I can do stuff like that because I feel like it. But that does mean I am quite capable of being flippant if I know the people are just being rude.
Well, I think we have to have a bit of a thick skin and be flippant every now and then. But anyway, we're going to bring up your PowerPoint. There's not many slides, folks, but there's lots of things to talk about. So we will do that. There we go. It's up there now. So interesting title. We've got lots to talk about because naval support is two words that means a lot more than just naval support. We're talking about, amphibious operations, combined arms, naval fire. So I'll kind of hand over to you and we'll see where this conversation takes us.
The point I have to make is after Salerno, Andrew Cunningham himself, a man who is famous for not writing long reports. In fact, his average report is usually 2 to 3 pages. Writes an 8-page report with 8 pages of appendices himself. Doesn't get anyone else to write it. Actually writes it himself about Salerno. Andrew Cunningham wrote 16 pages. That's practically for him. That is a thesis. That is a PhD. And the reason he wrote this was he actually went and saw the landings. He planned all the landings. And then he looked at a report which he saw, and I'll be talking about later, which is from a gentleman called Major Lindemann, who I cannot find out details about. So I'm fairly sure the name is entirely a cover name.
Right.
But he had been aboard Tartar during Operation Husky. And so during that particular assault, he had been writing down notes about what the destroyers were doing and how they were operating. And this report got to Cunningham. So Cunningham decided, well, after he planned Salerno and having an idea what he was probably going to end up being in charge of and involved in planning next, when it came time for Salerno, for Operation Avalanche, he decided to go back to HMS Tartar, a Tribal-class destroyer, and decided to sit on her and watch the operation. And so he got very, very close, because at one point he was sitting in the actual bridge of the destroyer, and they were going, there's a tank up there. It's firing on the troops. Can we reach it from here? No, it's a bit high, sir. How do we get there? Well, if we move all the crew to the back of the vessel and we go fast, we think we can start hitting it.
Wow.
And so there was and this is the thing about the Royal Navy. They're the only ones who don't think they're seeing Tigers all the time whenever they're seeing the tanks. They thought it was a 4.
Right.
So there was a Panzer IV which got deluged in about, considering the rate of fire of them, 124.7-inch shells within the pace of about a minute. I think that was either a terminal event or at least a significant emotional event for the tank crew. The reason I suggest it be a significant emotional event is just think about how big a 4.7-inch shell is.
Yeah.
And then 120 of them land around you in a minute.
Yep. Yep. It's
something a tank's designed for.
No. And neither is the destroyer. I mean, we didn't bring you in on our tank destroyer week, which we did a few months ago, about what is a tank destroyer. But in this case, a destroyer is up there as a what is a tank destroyer, because it is destroying a tank. Is it part of its doctrine? Maybe not. Is it part of its designated role? Maybe not. But it's destroying tanks. Is it a tank destroyer? But that's a rabbit hole we're not going to go down, because we'll get stuck at the bottom.
The other interesting thing is one of the sloops which was wandering around managed to beach herself at one point, trying to provide fire support. And then she changed her target to noticing that there was something on a railway line maneuvering. And again, if you go to see HMCS Hyder in Canada, which is the last remaining tribal class destroyer in the world, they've now taken it off, I think. But when she was originally in service, she had trains silhouettes inscribed on her, because quite a lot of tribals belong to the We've Destroyed Trains Club. There wasn't even an aircraft carrier, HMS Unicorn. Forward Aviation Support Ship.
Right.
It just looks exactly like an aircraft carrier, and the light fleet carriers are based off its design, which managed to destroy trains in Korea. They were annoying it. Okay, don't annoy a British carrier. They actually have guns. Will use them. They do not understand the idea that shore bombardment is something for their aircraft to be used for. So. And the Unicorn's actually involved in this operation as well, wandering around. But the thing is, the sloop spots this train. It's beached. It fires so many shells so quickly in the direction of what it thinks is a train, it manages to get itself unbeached. Basically, the Royal Navy were going around shooting at things, a lot of them. But they're also providing the forward fighter control, the fighter support. We think of the ships providing the fire support. They're also providing the air support. They're also providing the communications. There's at one point where the beach teams, their radios go down, and they are signaling out to a destroyer, which is then passing on the messages by radio back to high command until they can get a new radio. And actually, the destroyer gets fed up with being a signal relay, and so they find that they have a radio set aboard they can put into a boat, and they put it into a boat, and a chief petty officer, a Killick, and a couple of sailors take it up to the beach, and promptly don't manage to get back to destroyer for 5 days because their boat gets a hole in it. But they get a radio on the beach thing. Mm-hmm. So,
let's get your shameless plug in.
Yeah, I've got a shameless. Yeah, I do have a shameless book plug. I will apologize. I'm just closing the window because this fly is starting to come. But no, I always put in a shameless book plug in all my slides for my own channel because, well, a second edition of my book's coming out, and for a first book, that's kind of rare, especially the second editions come out before the second book has. Right. I'm not sure if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it's I put it in, and then I realized I'd left it in when I'd sent it to you, and I thought, well, we'll just skip through it quickly. But yeah, it's automatically put in all my slides because, as I think Paul would say, and I think pretty much every other historian would say, if we don't promote ourselves these days, no one else is going to.
Exactly. And it's easier to just kind of get out there and be open about it. We're commercial. Yeah. We're not making much, but we everything we make is important towards doing what we're doing. And so, yeah, there's nothing wrong with that. So
currently due to the crunch in the university sort of system moment, all the contract lecturers like me, quite a lot of us haven't had our contracts renewed for next year yet. So we won't know until the second week of October we're getting contracts renewed. So currently, my only income stream is this book and YouTube. Right. That's all I'm earning money through.
Yeah, well, there we are. There you heard it there, folks. So we've done some little stories about, vessels unbeaching themselves and firing at tanks, things like that. We're going to go back to kind of basics and talk about how amphibious warfare was conceived and what the plans were. And we've already got some questions building, but we'll deal with them later on, folks. But let's go back and to what the intentions were before the outbreak of war.
Oh, this is a good one. And I've noticed there's already a question coming about Philip Vian, and don't worry, I'll be getting to that. I've got a whole slides to do for Philip Vian, so don't worry, that'll be got to. Now, one of the interesting things I come up a lot, and I'm sure, Paul, you come up against this quite a lot as well, the amount of people who will tell you that basically after Gallipoli, the British ignore amphibious warfare until World War II. They do nothing in it. And you sit there and go, no, they did quite a lot. And they go, no, they ignored it. We're sure they ignored it. And you go, well, no, actually, they developed all the landing craft and things in the 1920s and 30s. They were working on them. They had exercises taking place in India, which is actually quite funny. But the British Army weren't keen on doing amphibious warfare. The Royal Navy wanted to practice it. And the British Indian Army were happy to take part in amphibious warfare. So the highly trained, the best trained amphibious troops in the British Empire in 1930s and right up until World War II were actually two of the Gurkha regiments of the British Indian Army, because they'd taken part in every single amphibious exercise the Royal Navy had done for about 10 years in the Indian Ocean. Whereas the British Army themselves weren't so keen on taking part. Eventually, they did start to take part. But even up until you sort of the 1938, and this is some of the details, some of the pages I have here come from that exercise, which took place in between 5th and 6th of July 1938. They are remarking that they need to learn a lot more. That as much as they have learnt and as much as they are learning, they need to learn a lot more. And there is a real sort of a small disconnect in that the Army's going, the prerequisites for an amphibious operation to be successful: complete control of the air, complete control of the sea, absolute fire support from every ship the Royal Navy has available, and land. Well, strangely enough, in 1938, they're talking about landing armor first. They think they need to land that first, and their trouble, their worry is they don't have enough landing craft which can take armored vehicles. So this is why they're having some interesting ideas coming through. Now, there is a small problem with that, in that these exercises are brigade strength. This one on the UK, and by the way, it's always a good one to know that basically it's they divide the UK into Eastland and Wessex. And Wessex is places like Cornwall, Devon, Somerset, Dorset, those areas, and they're against the rest of England. Disturbingly enough, sometimes, well, quite often actually, Cornwall seems to come out winning, but we'll leave that to one side. As someone who's got Cornish family heritage, it's not surprising to me, but we'll leave that to one side. But they're actually doing these amphibious assaults down the channel. And if you map some of their routes, they're going over the very same routes, which are then used in some of the preparations for D-Day. And some of the preparations for actually for Operation Sea Lion go on the same routes they were practicing on in 1936, 1937, 1938. They didn't have the exercise in 1939 because they were worried it might be seen as too aggressive. So do you know where they had the exercise instead?
No.
They decided to have it in the Mediterranean. They decided to practice looking at doing something of opposite Malta. They didn't actually. It's a debate as to whether or not they go through the full landing. It seems to me that they just do the administration and the testing for it from reports I've read. But there are some accounts which say a brigade was used, and some accounts which say a brigade headquarters was used. I think it's more likely at the time, in considering it's July 1939, it was a brigade headquarters, right, and they were just testing it out. But either way, this exercise itself is also interesting because of who you have in charge. You have Lieutenant General Waverley, and you have Admiral of the Fleet, Lord Corkenori. Now, Lord Corkenori is the gentleman who will absolutely muck it up in Norway and absolutely muck up many, many things, because he has a lovely habit in Norway. Let's put it this way, he was a very good admiral in peacetime. And he'd had a very good career. But when he got to Norway, he had a lot of personal relationships with a lot of different officers. And he had a habit of treating the communications like he was having a personal discourse with each of the officers. and not actually informing the wider force of what was going on and what he was agreeing to. And so different officers at different levels will sometimes know more than their superiors about what he was planning. And sometimes no one in the chain of command until you got very low would know what was planning. And so it went completely to pot, unsurprisingly. But yeah, it's an interesting experience for them, really, because they do this operation, and the first thing they find, and this is something which gets repeated throughout World War II, and it's one of the reasons why tribal class destroyers, etc., become so important, is that the destroyers are actually the most useful tools they have for on-call fire support. If you want to pre-bombard something, you want to use your battleships, your big, heavy guns. But the ships which are going to be closest to the fighting, ashore, are going to be destroyers, and the ones which are going to be quickest to react to you making a call on the radio are going to be the destroyers. What always disturbs me slightly about this, and it's probably to do with the way Combined Operations Command ends up getting set up and ends up getting run, is this has to be relearned again and again throughout World War II, including especially when we get to Operation Husky and we get to Salerno, and we get to Operation Avalanche. Those two operations teach so much that goes into D-Day, including reaffirming, because it keeps rearing its head, why you don't bring the aircraft carriers to D-Day, why you don't bring them to Operation Overlord.
Because that just so you know, as you would predict, one of the first questions we get from Robert was, my biggest hope for this show is why the Allied navies employed the types of ships that they did. Also, why not other types of ships were not deemed needed or wanted. So you're saying that even in the late 1930s, they're considering what types of ship are needed, and it's not necessarily what people think is needed.
Yes, and also one of the things they find quite quickly they work on, and this is going to sound strange, it's things like the R-class battleships, the slower battleships, the battleships which they are less likely to want to take off to do a fleet battle with, are more wanted for the amphibious operations than the fast ones. Why? Because if you're an amphibious commander and you're doing the operation, you're happier to have a battleship which your local task fleet commander is less likely to want to go off and fight a battle with than to have one which he's going to nick. Because Sod's law dictates the enemy are going to do something. They have a vote. They're going to do something which is going to be problematic. And if you've got a faster battleship or a modernized battleship, they're going to want that to go off and deal with it. Because the battleships are your big killing weapons. It's one of the things, again, my PhD thesis was on the development of naval aviation in 1920s and 30s. I'm a very big proponent of carriers and naval aviation. I love them. I think they're very useful. But they didn't in 1939. They were not at the level at which they were reliably killing battleships in 1939. And even by 1945, the sheer amount of firepower you want to bring at long range depends on the battleship being solo. If you're dealing with a combined group of battleships and carriers versus a group which is just carriers, the battleships and carriers will tend to win. Because of the capabilities of the battleships. They are designed to provide a lot of firepower and to take a lot of punishment. It does change. Things do come in. There are all the glide bombs, which also we're mentioning a bit because Paul Warspite gets a glide bomb in her at Salerno. And there's actually a picture in the slides coming up of a vessel which has been hit. So all of this is a factor. And all of this is stuff which is going on in the selection. But with aircraft carriers especially, and we'll get into that, what it comes down to is space to operate them. What it comes down to is also their necessity versus a huge amount of land-based air power.
Right.
But if we go to the next slide, which is, you could say is a shameless book plug, but it actually isn't. It's just I've used from my book because it's set out nicely and it's got all the details there. And the point is, the reason I quite like using this is because it was set out very nicely by Pen and Sword, but the assaults are acid, backed, scent, dime, and reserve for Operation Husky. And it's divided up. It's one of the things, again, we often have fun with in that I don't know if you do this as well, Paul. Sometimes people ask you about an operation, a top level operation, and you'll answer a question. They go, but that's not the bit I'm talking about. You go, okay, so which of the sub operations are you actually talking about? Because it's divided up, and they can be different sections. And I have fun dealing with some people who go, well, I'm sure they were taking part in this operation on their ship. And you go, well, that ship wasn't part of that operation. It was part of the other operation. And it's a case of the namings. And there's a reason why, though, they do all this naming and they do all these breaking up of the things. And it's a reason they started working on earlier in the 1930s. They know they need to break stuff up, and they need a way to differentiate who should know what. So if you give the different levels, different names, the different sort of task groups, if someone says, right, I'm taking part in acid, you give them the details for acid. They don't get the details of backed, sent, dime, or reserve.
Mm.
And it's a way of very quickly dividing information up so that people have the information they need. This helps you with two reasons. One, operation security, of course. That's always a big thing. But the other thing it helps you with is information overload. And this is something which, again, you found a good example of where it happened is in the Dieppe raid, where the ship commanders were pretty much getting all the information available. So much so, they had these huge files, and they were trying to figure out what their role was in it. And this led to some of the confusion you have at Dieppe with the fire control, because they're not quite sure which one they're supposed to be supporting. Because there's a list of it's just destroyer this, and they're going, okay, which destroyer, which one am I supporting? What am I doing? And when you've got Husky going on, when you've got Avalanche going on, when you've got all these operations, sort of invasion of Sicily, I don't know, the Mediterranean forces are very clearly divided up. Cunningham very carefully goes through, because Cunningham had been involved in some of these exercises in the interwar years.
Right.
He'd been a rear admiral destroyers. One of the interesting things about the Royal Navy is the amount of times I get told by people, oh, well, they were battleship Navy. And then you look at their senior officers and they're all destroyermen. They all come from the destroyers. And you then look at US Navy. Again, quite a lot of them are destroyermen. And it's a case of, no, if any mafia was running the navies in the 1930s and World War II, it was the destroyermen. They seem to be taking over. And Cunningham was really clear down his whole command structure. People needed to know what they needed to know and what was relevant to what they were doing. They didn't need to know anything else, because it was more information than they needed, and it could get confusing.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. I get the question all the time about when people say to me, so did Eisenhower know about such and such? And I go, probably not. They go, well, he was in charge. I said, but he can't know about everything. I mean, he would literally be behind his desk 24 hours a day for months. If someone was trying to brief Eisenhower on every tiny aspect, it would be pointless. He's got to retain that umbrella type position where he's overseeing the bits that are relevant for him, and then delegate down the chain. And it makes completely sense for something like Avalanche or Husky that the same situation would need to be in place.
You don't need it. If you think about it, if you've got to run a ship, if you're a destroyer captain, if you consider the reason destroyer officers often end up in charge, and I worked this one out quite early. On a destroyer, it's large enough they've got to do pretty much all jobs, but it's small enough every officer has to do all jobs. So every officer is going to have to learn a bit about engineering, learn a bit about this, but they're also going to quickly have to learn how to delegate. And they're also going to quickly, if you consider destroyers, they often have they're in flotillas, and that's the most junior rank in which you could be in command of multiple ships. So it's very good training for going on for higher ranks in the Navy. You have exposed to lots of different information, lots of different departments. You have to develop leadership skills early, and you start thinking about group leadership and coordination early. But if you think about that, a destroyer captain who's doing that scenario, who's coordinating the ASDIC, who's doing anti-submarine warfare, who's providing fire support whilst also looking for submarines, watching for aircraft, maybe doing fighter direction, dealing with the radio comms to the units they are supposed to be providing support to. Does he also want to know what the destroyers are doing on the other side of the next door operation? No. He doesn't need that. If he's having to look into his folder and go, hang on, had this problem come up. What am I supposed to do? What is my chain of command for this position? Who do I report ASDIC contacts to? Who do I report aircraft to? Hang on, the fighter direction ship's gone down. Who takes over that role next? He doesn't want to have a list of all the fighter direction ships in the entire area and the entire operation. He wants to know what is in his section, who is responsible. And at one point, fighter direction ships do go down. This happens during Salerno. The cruiser, which is doing fighter direction, has a radio malfunction. It goes down. Within 5 minutes, a destroyer takes over and is coordinating and has cleared the air and is saying, we're in charge, until the cruiser stands back up again, which is very, very good. That's very quick in terms of doing fighter direction, because if you think about it, the fighter direction at the time, they not only have to check the cruiser's not working, and that's usually done by flash signals. They also then have to check in with all the aircraft and all the carriers they are working with. So they all acknowledge that the person they're supposed to be transmitting to now is that destroyer to coordinate, not the cruiser. So it takes 5 minutes to do a full transition. And they do it, and they know they're supposed to do it. And it's because they're supposed to do it, they're carrying some extra radiomen. But you have to plan that, and you have to work that out in advance. And you have to make sure that it's a very simple list so that destroyer captain knows, well, it doesn't think, oh, there's 4 cruisers on fighter direction. There are 4 cruisers on fighter direction. However, they each have their own sector. And if you're in the sector where that cruiser's gone down, the other cruisers are busy coordinating aircraft in their own sectors. They're not going to cover that sector. So the destroyer has to take over. And it's something the Royal Navy has to learn again and again, and to an extent the US Navy learns it again and again. The US Navy, this is kind of interesting because they get this kind of massive culture shock in that, and this is something I love about the US Navy, they embrace the culture shock because they go into war thinking their small destroyers are going to do one thing and be for one thing. And suddenly they find them doing everything. And the destroyermen had realized that was coming, but some of the higher echelons of the US Navy, the ones who hadn't come from destroyers, certainly didn't think that was coming. Nimitz, oh, he's raring for that one. But some of them are going, huh? Why are the destroyers doing that? It's not a cruiser's job, isn't it? But he didn't have enough cruisers. He didn't have enough to be everywhere you need to do, to have the redundancy. So the destroyers are stepping up and taking on the job. And this is where, again, the large destroyers start to be a big feature. And this is actually something interesting for Cunningham, because when he gets onto Tartar to go and watch Salerno and use the space on Tartar for that, there's part of me which wonders if he was thinking back to a report he sent in 1934, where he recommended against the construction of larger destroyers because he never could foresee a reason when a large admiral's staff or senior admiral would have a need for them. So there was no need to have a large destroyer. They should all be small and of the attacking type. And the third Sea Lord at the time sent back a note to him going, I'm fairly sure that someday you will see the reason for them. And it was at this battle. He's in HMS Tartar. He is watching the operation going on. He's doing exactly the thing which that ship was envisioned for. And I do wonder if he was actually thinking back to that note, that report he'd written when he'd been a rear admiral destroyers in the Mediterranean Fleet.
Okay.
Are there any questions?
We've got some. Should we do some as well before we move on? Some of them you may be getting to anyway. So you're going to talk about Admiral Vian later on, aren't you? So yeah. Wireless communications, I guess, is going to come up, and radios. You've talked about that anyway. Josh is saying the Italian campaign is controversial. How did the Royal Navy feel about it before and after? That, I guess, comes back to Cunningham's report that you started with.
Yes, and the Royal Navy, it's going to sound strange with the Italian campaign. The Royal Navy saw it all as delivering the army. They had recovered the army from Greece. They'd recovered the army from where they need to in the Mediterranean. Their view was that they were there and this is something that we're starting by Cunningham, because Cunningham's, of course, famous line was, it takes 3 years to build a ship. it takes 30 to train a crew, 300 for a tradition sort of thing. And in the nicest way, he wasn't going to abandon the army in Greece. He was going to get them home. He wasn't going to abandon the army in Crete. He was going to get them home. And he was going to deliver the army where they wanted to go. So the Royal Navy don't see Italy as being a controversial campaign from the point of view of, oh, should we be going into Italy? Should we not? They see it as the army wants to go to Italy. That's where we'll go.
Okay, so they're considering themselves supporting the army. Brilliant.
They're sort of considering themselves a taxi service in that regard.
Yeah,
or alternatively, if it's a less nice version, they're considering the army the projectile and they're firing it where the army wants to go.
Yeah. And from the point of view of those who are watching who are less when things in the Mediterranean have calmed down. By September, October 43 anyway, haven't they? It's we're way beyond the difficulties of a year and 18 months earlier. So Italian shipping it's out of the game anyway because Italy has capitulated. So the Navy can concentrate on a more single role now, where earlier in the war they are spinning lots of plates, I'm guessing.
And earlier in the war, they've been fighting the Italians a lot. You have to remember that this is where I start to sound very controversial, but I will explain this one. The Italian Navy, for the early part of the war, before the Japanese entered the war, is the strongest Axis fleet.
Yeah,
there is a reason the Royal Navy concentrates so much force in the Mediterranean, because they are far stronger than their German counterparts. Yes, people like to talk about Bismarck, Tirpitz, and all these things. The Italian Navy has 6 battleships, all worked up, ready to go and ready to operate. At no point does the German Navy ever really have more than 2 available at any one time, and they never have more than 4 on the books. And that's theoretically on the books, because by the time one of them, the 4th one, is actually ready to operate, the 3rd one has managed to be lost, and one of the first 2 is actually in deep refit. So it's a case of the Italian Navy is always the far scarier Navy, the far more capable Navy. If you've got an example, he was in Battle of Sirte and Cunningham has this great line about Battle of Sirte. It was never a finer battle was fought, and never a finer battle was expected than cruisers and destroyers holding off these battleships, this major fleet. He wasn't expecting it, but they did it. It wasn't a victory for the British, but the fact that they weren't annihilated was considered a good thing. So the Royal Navy has this. They've been fighting a very, very strong war against the Italians, and the Italians, their mass boats, their small torpedo boats, have actually sunk HMS Manchester. That's the largest kill achieved by torpedo boats in the entirety of World War II, is HMS Manchester, which is not really nice for the Royal Navy to think about, because they lost to 2 pretty much World War I in terms of design, if not age, vintage Italian fast torpedo boats. But the Italians were a very capable force, and once the Italians were no longer part of it, and you have the various agreements, including Cunningham, actually a lot of the Italian naval stuff is actually done through a private agreement between Cunningham and the senior Italian admiral, rather than through the armistice agreement, because Eisenhower comes out of the armistice meeting with Marshal Brigliano and goes up to Cunningham, goes, we sorted everything out. And Cunningham goes, so what's happening with the Navy? And Eisenhower goes, oh! I don't know if he actually does oh himself, but apparently he looked wide and went, we forgot. And Cunningham went, so I'll sort it. And Ike went, yes, Andrew, please do. And you can imagine that there's so much pressure for Ike to sort that out, to get it perfect, to get the agreement right. He's gone through all the agreement, and he's completely forgotten about the Regia Marina. Where are they going to go? Where are they going to be surrendered? What's going to happen with them? But for the Royal Navy, that was the only thing they really cared about in the entire agreement. The only thing the Royal Navy were really worried about, because the moment the Italian Navy is out of the war, and they've made sure the Italian Navy is out of the war, that's when the Royal Navy can really start shifting east and can reinforce the Eastern Fleet and build the British Pacific Fleet. It's because they can move away from fighting in the Mediterranean and fighting in the North Atlantic. Because the joy of the interwar years, the Royal Navy had basically gone, right then, we can fight any 2 of our potential opponents. We can't fight all three. Sorry, politicians, you haven't given us enough money to do that. And that had been the plan by 1942, with a lot of investment spending, to have built up enough force to be able to hold in 2 theatres and fight in a 3rd. That was the plan, of how to have that force by 1942. They, of course, didn't get that because, you know, the politicians believing war was going to be held off till 1942 proved 3 years were 3 years too optimistic.
Yeah. Well, brilliant. People are loving it, by the way. I want to deal with one more question before we kind of move on to the next slide. So Trent Tolenko is saying, how did the fighter director DD work with the Royal Navy, Royal Air Force fighter director tenders running night fighters?
It pretty much, again, this was an interesting thing because the RAF wanted to set up a whole sort of separate system. But and when I talk about the RAF, I'm seeing the Air Ministry and their directives going, they need to do something special. It need to be all specially organized. And then the RAF fighter direction, the night teams, went and had a talk, having a meeting under Cunningham with the people who were doing it from the Royal Navy, who were fighter directors who mostly been trained in the aircraft carriers during the various operations in the Mediterranean, including, of course, the famous Malta convoys. And they went, oh, so you already have a practical system. You're all trained on this already. And they looked at the system and went, that's pretty much the same as our system already is. Because the fighter direction of night fighters had actually, Dowding had copied a lot of his systems from the people who already had a system, which was the Fleet Air Arm, which had been part of the RAF, had been shared with the RAF for many years in the 1920s and 30s. So a lot of the information flowed backwards and forwards between the two levels. At the Admiralty Air Ministry level, there's almost a constant political fight because the Air Ministry sees the Fleet Air Arm being independent as a threat to its very existence, which causes the issues. But once you go below that level, there's a lot of people sharing information on how to do things backwards and forwards quite quickly and quite equally, and going, right, then we have a lot of experience, or they've worked together with naval officers, they've worked together with the people who are now in the Fleet Air Arm, etc. They know them. So they actually found that the new system, which the Air Ministry was saying they should be doing for organizing, was a different system from the one they were actually using and the one which the Royal Navy was already using. So they ignored the new system, which was supposed to be better, but they never really tested it, and just went with the system they all knew.
Right.
And basically, it was very much, we are this sector, this person, the radar's on this control, and we transfer control between that sector, and we're directed in by the area fighter control, the area radar unit.
Okay, brilliant. Should we move on the slide?
Go on. Now, I put this slide in and this one in because it continues on with some of the stuff of what Admiral Cunningham did, and it's Major Lind, by the way, is the gentleman. If anyone ever manages to find any actual detail about him, I'd be really quite interested to know, because so far in all my searches of him, I cannot find anything about him existing. And he's just written as Major Lind in both his his actual file that he's written up and is sitting in the National Archives, and the Navy refer to him as just Major Lind. So I've never been able to, it's just interesting to me. But what we have going on, and what this describes going on, is very much what Rear Admiral Vian is doing, and this slide nicely transitions into that, because Vian is sitting there supposed to provide protection, and they've worked this all out very cleverly. They're going to go into Salerno, and by a certain number of days in, there will be a land airfield occupied, be put in, and they've got all the stuff with them to make that airfield work, fixed. They will bring in fighters from Sicily, and the carriers can withdraw. And air support will no longer be needed from the carriers. And whilst those carriers are providing support, escort carriers are smaller vessels, the larger carriers are sitting back and are providing air support over the carriers. So what you've got an interesting situation is you've got the fleet carriers sitting out at sea. They are providing fighter cover for the escort carriers, which are sitting closer into Salerno, which are providing the fighter cover over the beaches. So you've got kind of a sort of a daisy chain of fighter cover. Right. And all these fighters have to transition between sectors. So the fighters, when they leave the fleet carriers, have to transition to a different sector controller, which is usually Eurelis, the Vian's cruiser. He's using that as the sector controller because it makes sense. And he's coordinating everything from his cruiser, which he both likes and doesn't like. He thinks it's more sense actually to have the staff on a cruiser than have it on a carrier, because in his words, a staff just gets in the way of a smooth operating of a carrier. It's something when the Admirals puts it that way. The staff get in the way of the smooth operating of the carrier. But, you know, so he'd rather have them on his Dido class carrier, a Dido class cruiser. But, and the smaller carriers, basically with Unicorn at their center, and remember, this was supposed to be a forward aviation support ship. It was honestly not a light carrier governor. That's how Henderson and the Royal Navy had got it through procurement, had got it being built, everything. It was not a light carrier. It's not an aircraft carrier. It's just a forward aviation support ship. It's not. It doesn't impact on the treaties. It's completely, you know, it's completely independent. It's an auxiliary. It's an auxiliary, not an aircraft carrier. And well, that's sort of sitting in the middle, acting as almost a mother hen to these escort carriers running around it. But there are three troubles they're facing. We'll get into those with a further slide. So if you click on a slide. All right. The first thing you start to realize once you sort of looking into the lessons from Avalanche and this is the thing that comes up is you need wind. And during Avalanche, one of the things they're very happy with Cunningham is that they have the carriers operating. One of the problems they have is those carriers do not have enough wind. So they are trying to steam as fast as they can go. Escort carriers cannot steam that fast. They are really, really not that fast. Escort carriers were designed to steam with convoys and provide air support as in anti-submarine warfare with Swordfish for convoys. A Swordfish can take off in a stiff breeze, let alone when its own engines are going and the ship's moving. And once you add in rocket-assisted takeoff, they can really get going. However, there are small issues going on here. These escort carriers are not only escort carriers, they are loaded with something called a Seafire. Now, a Seafire is a lovely aircraft once it's in the air, because basically they've taken old Spitfires and they've done some rudimentary conversions to turn them into carrier aircraft. The trouble is the Seafire, as in its variation on the Spitfire, rather than the gull-winged aircraft which Supermarine were designing prior to World War II, which would have been called the Seafire. Well, the Spitfire was not really designed structurally for carrier operations, because as anyone who's ever seen a carrier landing will know, or experienced one will really know, landing on a carrier is basically a controlled accident. It's a crash that you move away from. It hurts. It hurts the aircraft. It hurts you. This is not something which is good for Seafires. When they're taking off, they need air, they need support, everything, because they're taking off kind of heavy. They're carrying bombs to do combat, do support and close air support, and they're also carrying a load of fuel, and they're carrying all that. They're very useful because they're quite close to the beaches. This is where aircraft carriers are really good, because you can get them close to your target. So it's a very short time to go back and refuel, rearm, and come back and hit them again. It's the complete opposite of Britain's intervention in Libya not that long ago, where they were making a big thing of, we're flying them from the UK. They fly from the UK several hours. They drop their bombs within about 30 minutes, and then they're flying back several hours. Yeah, that's not a thing to shout about. That's not
efficient. Yeah.
No, that's a thing to be slightly worried about. But the thing is, what does that mean for the Supermarine Seafires? It means they have to do a lot of landings and a lot of taking offs off very slow-moving carriers. So that's a lot of crashes and a lot of strains on their fuselage, etc., which is not good for them. But the whole thing is being put through as, how is the Navy supporting? And this is the important thing. This is actually from Cunningham's own report. This is from a 1945 copy of his 1943 report, right? Because the US kept requesting multiple copies of it, which is really good, because his original report we've lost. We can't find. but we can find the copies requested by the US in the UK National Archives.
Cool.
It helps. It makes it a little easier for a historian. We don't care as long as the record's there. And the whole thing that Cunningham's commenting on is the whole way through is the amount of space the carriers need to operate, and the fact they're moving up and down. And so if we go to the next slide, this comes from Philip Vian's own book. And basically what he was told was that landings had to succeed. He was told that without air support, the army forces could be driven back into the sea within hours. And so he had a choice. He could carry on with the rules that he'd agreed in advance of withdrawing Force V at the time he was supposed to, or he could drive Force V onwards. Now, the thing is, Vian is very much a destroyerman. He is the guy who, when he's in charge of the carriers in the British Pacific Fleet and is told by a senior British naval officer that one of the ones above him, there are two above him in the British Pacific Fleet, one of them tells him, you can't send a destroyer to go and pick up that downed air crew because it's too dangerous. Takes his flagship to pick up the air crew. And that is an aircraft carrier. And so, of course, a lot of destroyers and cruisers and battleships go with him. And his response to that senior admiral was, well, it wasn't too dangerous for the entire fleet to go pick him up, was it? But as much as he'll also do that, and that earns him the love of the fleet air arm, he's also quite prepared to do this, which is, we need to be here. There is no way we cannot support the army. We cannot fall back. So we're going to drive on. So even as the aircraft are falling apart, even as though they're running out of support, of supplies, of spares, of fuel, he's keeping the air going. He's keeping the aircraft up in the air. He's keeping the aircraft moving. And he's doing everything he can to keep them moving. He's visiting the ships. He's driving them hard. And he has to, because the ships also, this is the other thing with escort carriers, they're not very well ventilated, and they get very hot when they're running at high speed in the Mediterranean. All sorts of things which have changed. By the way, these same vessels go on and take up part in Operation Dragoon and all sorts of things in the Indian Ocean later in World War II. And they have been modified a bit by then, and they are so much better with this experience. But the point is, he's driving them to keep them there, to keep up the air support, because if he doesn't, they fall apart. And he knows that. And if you can imagine, if you're a rear admiral at this time and you're told that if your group falls back, the enemy will win, what are you going to do? Are there any questions? Because I'm conscious there's a lot of comments moving up and down in the chat.
Yeah, no, it's busy. They're all kind of scattergun, random questions, but let's deal with a few of them now. So we have one about, we're talking about the Italian Navy. It's a quick kind of yes or no one almost. Except Roma and Vittorio Veneto, were any Italian battleships modern or refitted like the Royal Navy counterparts? You talked about the strength, but are there? There's a big rabbit hole.
All their battleships had been to an extent modernized, and the Littorios, there are 3 of those completed. Littorio, Vittorio Veneto, Roma are all completed. They are damaged at points. Some of them are damaged at Taranto, and then they are brought back into service. Taranto, it's one of those things. Taranto, Matapan, they buy the Royal Navy time. They're often, and sometimes people market them as decisive victories, which stop the Italian fleet from operating. What they do is they give the Royal Navy time, but still there are battles not that long after Taranto where you have Giulio Cesare and Vittorio Veneto both come out and are basically hunting down British groups. And HMS Renown and Ark Royal and Sheffield end up having a running fight with them at one point, with Renown basically hanging back behind Ark Royal going, if you try and catch Ark Royal, you're going to have to get through me. And the odds are, let's be honest, Renown's going to get smashed in that fight. She would have got absolutely smashed. She'd have put up a good fight. It's HMS Renown. She's taken on Scharnhorst and Gneisenau solo and driven them off. She's not really worried, but she wouldn't win that fight. But that is what the Italians can do. They've got 2 battleships going out, and that's a regular operation for them.
Okay. This is going into your book, really, from Frank. If most of the tribals had survived to 1943, what roles would they have seen in the rest of the war?
Well, 10th Flotilla at D-Day is a good example of them, and that's another thing that they were handpicked from the experience of the Mediterranean Fleet for this. 10th Flotilla is where all the remaining British tribals and Canadian tribals and some Polish vessels get grouped together into this destroyer flotilla, which is a really unique command. And they are given the authority that if they are dispatched into the channel to deal with any German threat coming up the channel to attack D-Day, to attack the amphibious forces going in, any of the convoys, everything else leaves the area for them. Everyone else, admirals, no one can supersede their command. Once they're deployed, the commander has complete blanket authority to overrule everyone. Everyone gets out of his way to engage the enemy. And this actually leads to a battle against the German torpedo bottom flotilla and a destroyer. No, it's a Sora flotilla, and it's a really nasty, vicious fight where the Germans, rather like in Narvik, end up beaching themselves through minefields to get away from the British. Mainly, also not just the British, but also the Canadians, because at one point the Canadians are literally stalking their way through minefields, and this ship that's hiding and that's been using the minefield to try and keep away from them basically just goes, they're still coming, they're insane, and rams itself ashore to get away from them. At which point they continue firing at it and consider lowering boats and sending boats to try and capture it and pull it off. But the Canadians are very how do I put this? Do have a slightly collect them all attitude to enemy ships in World War II. They're very keen on the idea of prize money. Very keen on it.
Brilliant stuff. Right. Couple more questions, then we'll get back to the Salerno. So I think this one will probably be coming up in your next little bit. But which destroyer made most and vital and crucial naval gunfire support to the shore during any amphibious attack? Are you going to come to that kind of?
I think that's a hard one to go through because so many destroyers do so many weird things. But I would say possibly, I think that I will go back to one in Norway, actually. And the reason I go back to this one in Norway is because it's during Navos, the attacks up there and sort of the operations around Carlton de Weert's command. And one of the destroyers, HMS Somali, is the first British destroyer to destroy a railway train. And destroys the steam engine and the train going around, which actually had a gun on it. And they were using the gun to fire, and then they were using the train to pull themselves back into a tunnel to hide, and then doing that. And it destroys it. And that sets the habit for destroyers to destroying trains from then on. So I feel that that's kind of possibly all of them are very important, but that kind of is a trend-setting one, because from that point onwards, it becomes a competition to see who can destroy the most trains.
Okay, brilliant. One more, then we'll go back to the presentation. So Frank is asking, were the Didos the best cruisers to use in the flag role, not the town class? And I have no idea what that really means, that question.
Okay, let's put it this way. If you consider, and I would often describe tribal class destroyers as back pocket cruisers, because they are cruiser-built destroyers. They're destroyers, but they have a lot of space on them, which allows them for staff. Didos were destroyer-built cruisers. They are light cruiser hulls, the smallest light cruiser hull you could build, crammed with as many weapons as you can. So they're actually really tight for staff. But they still are actually easier for a staff to go on than a carrier, because especially as British carrier air groups increased in size in terms of the numbers of aircraft, as they started doing deck parking, because they're operating in seas where they could actually do deck parking. The reason the Royal Navy didn't do deck parking in North Atlantic was it was a good way to lose aircraft. They tried it in the 1920s and they kept losing entire air groups. So that's why they didn't do it. And this is one of the reasons why carrier group numbers are so different from the beginning of the war to the end of the war, because they start doing deck parking. And the reason they're doing deck parking is they're operating in seas where you can do deck parking and not lose your entire air group. When the Americans tried deck parking in the Atlantic, they found it was just as bad. So their air group shrank down as well in the North Atlantic versus how they were in sort of the Pacific. Right. But the thing is, when you consider when Vian has to transfer in the British Pacific Fleet between carriers, his staff. He actually finds he's kicking officers out of their messes, etc. He's kicking people out of their sleeping spaces to use as the offices for his staff. And he really doesn't like that. He would have preferred to be operating from a cruiser, because cruisers, especially even some of the Didos, are actually fitted out with space for a staff. So they actually have designated staff space. Not all the carriers were built with designated staff space. It's really kind of strange. The Royal Navy doesn't get into the habit of putting staff space in all of them until later in the war. And by that, it's almost too late. Ark Royal had staff space. Courageous and Glorious had staff space. What are the three carriers which are lost in the war? Courageous, Glorious, Ark Royal. And then you go, well, Illustrious, that must have had staff space. Well, it has staff for Rear Admiral aircraft carriers, not a Rear Admiral aircraft carriers who has 6 carriers under his command and is in charge of a task force. That's a far larger staff. It's a far bigger responsibility. You need a far greater range of personnel. And so this is a problem for them as they go through the war. It's a problem with the design.
Okay, brilliant.
And so Town Class would have been better because they're the bigger cruisers, but Dido was still better. It was better than the other option.
Okay, brilliant. Well, back to you then. We've done a few questions. Let's crack on.
Well then, if we actually skip on to the next slide, you'll get some pictures. There is a lovely picture of Philip Vian. There is a picture of the escort carriers actually doing Operation Dragoon, because I can't find a decent picture of Task Force V during Salerno. You've got Euryalus, and you've also got HMS Unicorn, by the way. The far ship along here from me is not an aircraft carrier. That's a forward aviation support ship. I'm hoping everyone understands this.
I think you've made that point. You've made that point.
Yes.
Yeah.
Good. I just have to be careful, because the Royal Navy were very honest, and it was not an aircraft carrier. And what they're particularly doing, and particularly finding an issue, is the space needed to operate, because 3 times during Salerno they have to send in minesweepers. Why? To clear the minefield, to give them more space to operate. Not just the enemy minefield, but also allied minefields which have been laid to try and protect them from torpedo boat attack and make that job easier. And this is the big factor when you start to get into planning for Normandy and D-Day, because how much of the minefield do you have to clear? Now, if you consider the scope of the minefield that was cleared for D-Day alone, and the amount of clearing that was done, they estimated at one point for carriers operating, if they'd had similar conditions as Salerno, i.e. the lack of wind, and been using the escort carriers rather than fleet carriers, which they probably would have been doing, because do you really want to risk a fleet carrier in that position? You could have needed to double or even triple the task. That would have delayed D-Day by at least a year. It's not practical. When you've got enough aircraft coming from the UK that you can generate enough on-call air power over the beaches from the UK, and you've got fire support coming from other scenarios, you don't need the carriers. But then that pushes something else, because another reason Vian's so important here, and Vian's carriers are so important, is because Warspite and the other battleships and even the heavy cruisers had been held back at Salerno. They hadn't been sent in. They hadn't been sent in because, this is the annoying problem, because the idea was there wasn't enough space for them to freely maneuver, and it was felt that maybe they weren't needed. So they hadn't done as much of a preparatory bombardment. They hadn't done as much as what they needed to do. They hadn't been there and on call. And so the carriers were even more important for providing that ongoing air support. And when you did call them back in, of course, the Germans very quickly took advantage of that and started coming in to try and hit them. Interestingly enough, and this is one of the things that's always interested me about this battle, is if they'd hit the escort carriers with that guided bomb, with that very useful system. By the way, the first of it had ever been, the first time it's ever used was actually used on a sloop in the Bay of Biscay. It wasn't used. It wasn't as so much of a surprise at this point as people like to think. The British had known it was coming. They had lost the sloop, and I did a video about it. I think it was about a couple of weeks ago or so ago. Right. A video came out in my key ship series about the sloop which was hit and why it was important. The reason when it sort of gets hit and that has an impact, the British then start working out what happens if it hits certain different things. Hitting a battleship is probably the most able to survive, because, especially Warspite, because as part of her reconstruction, instead of having enough and being given more engines, i.e., more boilers and up to the gears, so she could go gearing, so she could go to 28 knots, which had originally been the design aim for the Queen Elizabeth class, they decided to keep the speed roughly the same and put in more subdivision. So she was even more subdivided than she had been in previously in World War I, or even after her post-World War I reconstruction, when they'd been going over and fixing some of the damage she received at Jutland when she did her donuts in front of the German High Seas Fleet. As you do as a battleship, solo donuts in front of your enemy fleet, you might as well. That ship, seriously. The fact we're naming a ballistic missile submarine after Warspite is the most worrying thing we've ever done. Because that name has a history of firing without command, of doing donuts in front of enemy fleets, of completely disobeying any orders that its crew are trying to give it, and you're naming a ballistic missile submarine after it.
I hadn't connected the dots on that, but now you've made me think now. Yeah.
Just no. But as she's doing all that, as she's called in, she gets hit, she gets damaged, but she's able to be worked on and able to be fixed. She's not like Roma, which unfortunately suffers let's put it this way, a scenario which is everything that can go wrong goes wrong list. And that's why what happens to Roma when she's hit. But the thing is, if they hit one of the escort carriers, they'd have actually destroyed the ship probably in one go. They'd have made it go completely up. And the account afterwards, the discussions afterwards by Cunningham and others afterwards, is that the view is that Wien was pushing them so hard, was making them run about so much and maneuver so much, that actually the German aircraft were deciding they just couldn't guide in on them because they weren't stopping moving. Whereas Warspite, doing its fire support, was actually more predictable in its pattern, rather than these escort carriers, which were changing random direction to try and chase every bit of wind they can get. There's the randomness of zigzagging, and there's the randomness of going, where's the wind sock moving? Wind that direction, change now! It's a completely different level of random. And yeah, it works well for them. But no, Wien's a complicated soul. He's a he expects himself to be the best, and he expects others to be the best. But he also conversely has managed to sink 2 destroyers in interwar year, bashing them up completely. Including once racing into harbour and all sorts of random things. He's kind of like Nimitz that way. And again, if you're doing your duty and you're being aggressive and trying to get the enemy, if you suffer problems, he will not see you have any damage. And one of the great things is when he goes to goes to Churchill, and Churchill offers him to replace Mountbatten. And he turns down it going, I would prefer to have I understand your honor. It's a great honor, the post you want me to replace Mountbatten, all these things. But, and I can understand you want a man of aggression, but that's a desk post. Whereas I've been offered another post coming up, which is going to be an active command where I'll still be fighting.
Right, yeah.
And of course, Churchill loves hearing that level of flannel. And Churchill goes, yes, of course, you want to be where the fighting is. You're a fighting admiral. I'd like you in this post to replace Mountbatten, but you're a fighting admiral and you want to go fight. I will accept that. And Wien is... I'm not sure if he's the last admiral of the fleet of the Royal Navy, but he's certainly one of the last few admirals of the fleet we've had.
And he was, as Ian Carr is saying, pretty much at sea for 6 years of the war.
Yes. I think at one point he calculated after the war he saw his wife on 3 occasions in the entirety of World War II.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. That's sobering stuff in that regard. So just to kind of recap this, because with our other shows about some of the infantry divisions, we've been comparing Torch, Husky, and Avalanche. Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking now that as it's coming to that, is this the first, the one where the threat of the German air power is the biggest?
Yes, because it's the closest to it.
Yeah, I mean, because I assumed as much because Torch, there's not that much left in North Africa. Sicily, they've got to bring it from Italy, and so now, and this sort of congested space off the coast as well.
It's congested. It's the highest threat environment. Also, if you think about it, it's also the one which receives the least support, because Torch is a huge combined operation where the British and the Americans bring everything, and they bring so much. There's actually a spike in the number of ships being sunk on the Atlantic crossings. Why? Because all the convoy escorts, all the escort groups are being shortened down so that extra ships can go and support the escort of Torch. That it just sucks in everything to make sure Torch is a success. And it has all sorts of fleet carriers. Everything they can put with it is with it, and able to maneuver and freely support it with the space they have. Again, with Sicily, you have a lot of space to maneuver, so you can have the fleet carriers involved. And the good thing about fleet carriers is they have everything on them, so they can be used as fighter direction ships. Everything is in coordinated one, and when the pilots come down, the admiral can have a conversation with them, and then they can go up. And yes, it's problematic from a staff perspective, but they're there. But when you're at Salerno, you have got, well, Sicily is part of the reason you don't have much space to maneuver.
Yeah,
you've got you've got all sorts of these lovely islands blocking around your routes of maneuver, and all because you're not just having to watch for yourself where you're maneuvering, but you're also having to watch for, in terms of maneuvering into your own supply routes, because you've got the convoys of troops and their supplies constantly coming through and need to be escorted through. Because we often think of a landing as the troops turning up and then being landed. But actually, it's the beginning of a massive logistical operation where you have people at one end who are loading ships, and then the other end you're unloading ships, and it's just a continual movement. The ships going backwards and forwards, and you need to cover those ships. And then you've got those ships coordinating. We talked about fighter direction ships, but a lot of the admirals involved in this point, and a lot of their staffs are doing ship direction. Are literally coordinating the moves of ships, because especially once you've got Vian going everywhere and going, right, now I'm a rear admiral, I'm at the charge at the front of my group, we are going through because we're providing air support, so we have priority to go, right? And so give them priority to chase the wind. That means you have to start routing convoys. If you think about that, where your convoy's getting close and you're trying to get to the beach, you're going, hang on, where is Force V going? What are they doing? How are they maneuvering? Okay, we need to bring you south, we need to bring you north, we need to and it becomes very congested very quickly. And that also means you need to, again, keep widening that area cleared by the minesweepers. And they just have to keep working. The minesweepers are just non-stop working. And that's one of those roles which you really don't think of in terms of support and naval support for the force ashore. But the minesweepers are most crucial, because without them, nothing is coming through to you. And occasionally they get involved in the actual fighting as well, because occasionally there is at one point, there is a minesweeper clearing a path, and it notices a position is holding up some British infantry, and it turns its pom-pom on it and just blasts 40mm in the direction of the position. So you can imagine that causes the troops who were holding that position to go, we prefer to be elsewhere. You know, a pom-pom is a lot of firepower for an infantry unit to take on. And so the British troops were out. There was no radio communication, no coordination. They were just looking out, and they were just sweeping and making sure they're sweeping along the beaches and going, hang on, they appear to be in trouble. Move the pom-pom round. And the reason they didn't do the 4-inch gun at the front, and this was from the actual quote of the scenario, why they didn't do the 4-inch gun, was because the 4-inch gun crew were too busy helping out with the deployment, and there was a snag with the deployment of the paravines, which were being used for the mine clearing. So they were doing that. So the next heaviest weapon they had, which was actually still, of course, crewed and manned, was the 40mm AA gun. And so that came down, swept round, and swept the position.
Okay. Just talking about Sicily and congestion. One of the, it could be a potential big rabbit hole, but I want to ask you, during the Husky series I did, the German retreat across the Messina Straits came up, and whether or not more should have been done or could have been done to have prevented that. We had people giving it from the aviation point of view, the army point of view. As a naval historian, what could more have been done to prevent the German retreat?
Now, this is one of the interesting things. When Germany starts retreating from North Africa, Cunningham gives the order allowing the Royal Navy to do what they need to do to stop them. And they are really annoyed to find that the Germans make barely any effort to retrieve them. When they are getting to the retreats across Messina, again, the orders go out, but the trouble is getting things into Messina. And the things you need to get into Messina, the really good things, would be some dog boats, i.e. the Royal Navy's Fairmile D flotilla torpedo boats. The trouble is they were in the wrong place. And by the time they arrived, it was over because they were off helping out with another operation. They had to help finish that operation and then come away. That was part of the trouble. They didn't have any ships which were literally free and able to move. Because you don't want to take a battleship into the Messina Straits. You don't. You just don't, okay? It's really not a good place for a battleship to go. But the smaller boats, the destroyers and the torpedo boats, are what you'd want to send in. The trouble is the destroyers you want to send in are your tribal-class destroyers, which are also acting with all sorts of other duties. And they were off escorting convoys. And the same with the torpedo boats. They were off doing stuff. And that's your problem, really, in that, in a way, the German escape, the German retreat, took them a bit by surprise, in that they hadn't managed to get anything in position to deal with it. And that, I think, is the problem for across all the forces, in that there are lots of things they'd like to do, and they could do if they had the forces in place. And for that, you need to have the force in place, which means you need at least a day's notice, probably, because they're all busy. This is the thing. It's one of the interesting things you get into once you start doing military history and naval history is people look at the force tables and they see the huge amount of forces that are allocated to different operations, and they almost see, well, you can do whatever you like with them. But actually, once you start going down the list, you've got them assigned to things. It's like Vian with his carriers going around, right? And so he's got a couple of cruisers. He's got, including his own flagship, he's got the escort carriers. He's got Unicorn. He's also got a whole load of destroyers providing escort in case of submarine, in case of air attack as part of. So that's a whole force going through and assigned off. And are you going to take the destroyers off Vian to go and do something else? Well, if you do, that's leaving your carriers exposed. So you can't. So those destroyers, they are on your force table. They are there as part of your force, but you can't do anything with them. And it's the same once you go down quite a lot of the forces. So very quickly you find what are the free forces to do. And this is one of the difference. This is sort of the difference you have at D-Day, because you have enough forces and you have things like 10th Flotilla, which are literally designated as free forces to go and do what you need to do. And that's something else which Cunningham takes from his experience in Mediterranean, where he didn't have free forces. He didn't have enough forces to have the free forces. And 10th Flotilla is a really interesting organization because basically Cunningham gets to hand pick a flotilla. He's basically told he can have American, British, any destroyers he wants for the mission. He can have whatever he needs. And he has this conversation with Ramsey. He has the conversation with Vian over what they want. And they get tribal class destroyers in with Royal Navy and Royal Canadian Navy crews. And they get a few Polish destroyers in as well. And they're put together. The idea, the simple view they're ordered is, whatever you do, do not allow the Germans to come through. We don't care what you have to do to stop them. You stop them. If you have to round them, if you have to, whatever you need to do to stop them is worth it. We do not want Operation Tiger repeating itself. We don't want anything like that with the main happening. And that's what they're there for.
Okay, that's fair enough. Let's get back to should we move on to the next slide in the air power or air support?
So this is where you get an interesting importance of air support, and this is one of the things I found interesting, because I found this is a page from Philip Vian's book, and Action This Day. It looks very, very simple. Unlike Cunningham's book, it hasn't had a very new, very sexy version produced. Cunningham's Odyssey, I've got the original version there, right, but it's had this version produced recently. So if you want it, you can go and get it. And it's produced from Seaforth. So it's a really nice, Sailor's Odyssey and the autobiography of Admiral Andrew Cunningham. This is Philip Vian's Action This Day. I also have in here Carton the Weird, which is a really fun read. But that's also, as Paul would, I'm sure, tell everyone, if you are looking for people in a running of who was the most insane commanders of the Allied forces in World War II, Carton the Weird possibly wins, but is definitely nowhere lower than top 3.
Okay.
Of people who are actually insane, who are in charge. He is the living embodiment of the Black Knight from Monty Python. He loses an eye. He loses an arm. He loses this. He's still fighting. He's still leading. And he sort of go, just retire. Retire.
We'll have to do a Christmas special on loony leaders, I think. There's
oh,
a nice...
good Lord.
Yeah. And the ones that are considered to be loonies that probably aren't loonies, like Chindits.
Yes. Wavell.
No.
Wingate.
Wingate, yeah. Who people say Rob Lyman says he isn't insane at all. He just acts like it.
Yes. And then you've got Carton the Weird, who definitely is insane.
Yeah.
He is absolute. Please, if no one has known him, look him up on Google and Wikipedia. You will see his picture. And it sums him up completely. This is one of the only pictures going around of him. And literally, there's him with his eye patch. And I think the picture last I checked had him with a eye patch sitting in the middle of a veranda with one arm missing. And in the other arm is a glass of brandy. And this is the man who at one point, because he didn't have any reconnaissance in Namsos in Norway, decided to ski in front of his troops, even though he'd never skied before. And he already had a damaged leg, to find out where the Germans were. And skied up to where the Germans were. You know, as you do. He managed to avoid. He didn't get captured.
Yeah, no, he is. Yeah, he is quite a character. But anyway, yeah, let's we've done insane people in charge. But back to the case in hand.
Back to this. Now, as you can see, this is USS Savannah, and she was the first to be hit by a glider bomb. And what's really interesting is they actually had a picture of her not long after she was hit. And what they've decided that had happened was caused because there'd been a small break in the air coverage. Because as time went on, there started to be wearing down. Remember I talked about the daisy chain of air coverage that was going on? Well, if you can imagine with any daisy chains are not particularly strong as a rule. And they start to break down after a while. And this is what Via noticed. They started to break down. And someone else in the chat commented earlier, eventually you run out of aircraft. Well, yes, you do. And eventually you run out of pilots as well, because they get damaged as well, the Seafires. But you have to keep going because you have no other option. Because if you're not there, then this will happen a lot more often. Because this is what happens when they break down and they've not got possibly proper air coverage in the right place for roughly 5-10 minutes. Imagine if they didn't have any there at all. Imagine how many German strikes get through. And the thing is with naval air defense, and it gets very different in a way than even today, especially our today's appreciation of air defense. Air defense for the Royal Navy in 1920s and 30s is about deterrence of enemy aircraft. So you have sort of these outer air areas. So the fighters, their job is to break up enemy air attacks into flights properly. So if they've got coming in squadron strength, wing strength, you dive in amongst them, you break them up. You're not there to kill them. If you do, great. If you don't, it doesn't matter. What matters is you break up the enemy strike. So they're broken up. And then you use your heavy AA, your 4.5 inch, your 4.7 inch, your 4 inch, all that stuff to break them up, 5.2, 5 inch, whatever it is, to break it up even further. So you break up from flights into single aircraft coming towards you. So now they're attacking each ship, so you've got to deal with a single aircraft at once. And then your 40 millimeter and your other stuff engages. And maybe they take it down, maybe they deter it, but hopefully, whatever they do, you're only dealing with one aircraft attacking it. Now, the real problem for dealing with glide bombs is because they're not going to come to the 40 millimeter gun range. So you've got to start changing your entire doctrine. Your entire doctrine is based around the idea of torpedo bombers and dive bombers. of aircraft which have to either come and fly low and steady to drop their torpedoes to hit you, heading straight for you, or aircraft which have to dive straight down onto you. So aircraft which have to come into your very close bubble. Glide bomb sort of aircraft, they can launch their bombs from far further away. They can drop them and they can be sort of at a nice height where they can avoid your 40mm. So it changes things. It means also you have to start, it's the start of the changing the emphasis for especially air defense aircraft away from breaking up to trying to take out their opponents. And you can argue this is actually the sinking here of the Savannah is the damage of the Savannah here is the starting point for the development of what will eventually lead to the F-14 Tomcat. Because it's from this point on, the US Navy starts seriously thinking about how do you kill enemy aircraft and killing them as far away from your ships as physically possible. And that's basically what the F-14 is all about. The F-14 is entirely emphasizing killing enemy aircraft. But why are these ships in this place in the first place? Of course, they're providing fire support. They're trying to help the beachhead because without them, without Force V, they are, and without the cruisers providing, those troops are completely unsupported. They don't have enough depth. They don't have their artillery set up properly yet. They don't have the airbase. Once they finally get them, once the beachhead is finally consolidated and they are able to be there, they are able to be moved back, and Force V is able to be moved back. But at a certain point, once they've moved Force V back and they've got the aircraft there, then it's the battleships, the cruisers and destroyers are even more important, and they're coming in and they're providing fire support. At one point, the destroyers are quite literally securing the beach side of the attack, because you know there's sort of the Germans sally forth and they're really worried they're going. The firepower from the sea, which stops that dead, are the destroyers going in as close as they dare. Yes, there are battleships and cruisers firing, but they're firing indirect fire. They fire and maybe it hits, maybe it doesn't. Let's be honest. A 16-inch or 15-inch shell going off nearby you is going to be a significant emotional event, whether it hits you or not. You're going to see an entire portion of a hill disappear. It's going to make you think about it. But what's going to kill you is going to be the 4.7-inch shells, which are raining down hard straight at you. And they are coming in close, being used as direct fire weapons. And that's the equivalent of, at one point, I think it was Mark Clarke who said it, that, and this is where I got the quote from for tonight's story, was that the destroyers on his flank were equivalent to a tank brigade on his flank. That was what he was getting in terms of firepower. But when you add up, sort of think about it, if there's a flotilla of destroyers, there's 8 destroyers going along, and they roughly have 6 to 8 4.7-inch guns each, that's a lot of firepower and possibly does equate in compared to roughly similar numbers of guns as a tank brigade might have. I can't remember quite how many tanks were in a brigade in 1943. I'm trying to remember from the top of my head. You are much better at this than me.
Well, in the German army, it's how many they can muster. I mean, anything from a few dozen to more than a few dozen. Yeah. But yeah, we just had a good question about the anti-aircraft fire from Peter O'Connell. Did the Royal Navy have access to US VT proximity fused AAA ammunition?
Yes, both they developed their own as well at a similar time, and they both have it going through. It's a sort of almost a common pool in terms of the VT. The British tend to have theirs fitted to their 4-inch guns, so the 4-inch are the ones which get it first, then the 5.25s, and then later on some of the other guns get it, but mainly it's the 4-inch and the 5.25s. But interesting enough, the 4-inch, they find another use for it. It's not just used for anti-aircraft. It's also found to be very useful for being used for anti-torpedo boat. Because, again, you've got a small torpedo boat coming towards you. It's basically an aircraft, but it's going lower. And the Royal Navy find out very quickly that they can modify their shells and make them work with torpedo boats. So and the US Navy, when they spot the Royal Navy doing that, go, we like that. And the idea cross-pollinates it. The two worked very closely together in World War II. It's quite disturbing. British Armed Brigade, thank you, Tamsin, would have about 150 to 160 tanks. So if we consider 6 to 8 tons, yeah, so okay, it's about a third of a British Armored Brigade, but it's a lot more than the German one.
Yeah. No, brilliant stuff.
Yeah.
Are we moving on to the next one? Lessons learned, and then kind of begin to start winding things up.
Go on, because I think I've gone massively over time.
Yeah, well, people are loving it. It doesn't matter.
I do apologize. Lessons learned. The biggest lessons which started to infect, especially D-Day planning, and reconfirmed them, and especially when Vian and Cunningham came back to the UK and backed up Ramsey, is that the carriers were not an option for D-Day. They keep coming back. People keep telling Ramsey, you've got to include carriers. You've got to have carriers. You've got to have that on-call air support from carriers, and keep going, I can't clear enough space on them. I can't clear enough space for them. And when Cunningham and Vian come back, Cunningham's going no, and Vian's going no. I'm not doing that again. I'm not doing that again. Because of course he gets command of the British fleet, the British forces in Overlord, or rather Neptune, and he's sort of going, no, I am not commanding that task force. I'm not having carriers. It just won't work. The other thing they start to do is, this was actually a benefit of Lindeman's report, which they then tried out at Salerno, and then they do a sort of some Husky, it comes in, and then Salerno they tried out, is they try and introduce, especially the destroyer crews who are going to be providing fire support to the troops. They try and make there be connections. They want to have there being some sort of balls or anything they can to try and build some connections between the two groups. Because what they found very quickly was, if they knew each other, the army had far more confidence that they would provide the fire support, but also the lengths the Royal Navy crews would go to ordinarily when they didn't know them was quite far, but when they did know them, they took obscene risks. I mean, we talk about USS Texas flooding one side to make herself be able to fire further. That is a massive, massive hat tip to USS Texas. But the thing is, the Royal Navy destroyers and the US destroyers and all the destroyers involved in D-Day do some absolutely absurd things when you look at the theoretical depths marked on maps of the waters of the beach and close to beaches, how close they're getting versus their supposed safe operating depths. They are pushing themselves in as far as they can to provide as accurate direct fire as they can. Because again, you have to remember, all those destroyers, they're visually targeting. We think of fire control, we think of all the modern fire control systems, even the fire controls on destroyers, even when they had radar fire control, etc. When you're engaging land targets, especially positions which are hiding behind earth, the radars at the time weren't going to be much of any help. So it was going to be visually. And it might be, you might have a director system that could direct it, but that could also be taken out, or that could be damaged. In which case it's local control amongst the gunnery crews. And that's when it really matters. The local gunnery crews will be spotting the targets and will be engaging. And you have examples of destroyers engaging 3 or 4 positions at the same time with their different guns. They've got the 40mm raking one position. They've got the A mount focusing on one, B mount focusing another, an X mount giving a kicking to something else. And this is the point about the destroyers. They are providing all this fire support and getting as close as they can. And this is where someone like me starts to get annoyed. And it's the whole reason I actually ended up writing the book I did, was because I got fed up with the amount of accounts where it would list the cruisers by name, the carriers, battleships, and then go, and 17 destroyers.
Right, yeah.
What were those destroyers? What were they doing? You know, who were they? It's like there's an account of Cunningham going around Salerno. He was aboard a destroyer. Which one? That's kind of important, because if you want to know what he's going to see, you need to know what destroyer he's on. And it's very quickly, once you start to look at the tracks, it's very easy to work out which destroyer is on, because there's one destroyer which keeps nosing its way into every single part of the entire operation and turning up in odd places and completely ignoring what it's supposed to be doing. Okay, that's going to be the one with the commander-in-chief on, because that's the only one that's going to have the permission to do that, because no one's going to tell the CNC, no, you can't take your destroyer where you want to go, sir. No, Cunningham, you're not doing that. But then if you consider what happens during D-Day itself, what are all the VIPs moving around on? What are they all positioned on? It's destroyers again. Because there's two reasons for that. One, they are large enough to accommodate them, but they are small enough and ubiquitous enough that the enemy are unlikely to select them. They will be targets of opportunity, not targets of intent.
Right, okay.
Whereas battleships are always going to be targets of intent, because let's be honest, the moment you have a battleship there, that becomes a big, big visible target of intent.
Yeah.
Okay. And 17 shows for D-Day destroyers. They're absolutely in nuts. The Battle of Ile-de-Batte is just that battle is one of the ones where once you start looking into it, the destroyer operations and the amount of different. This is one of the things I got into in my book when I was going through it. Was very quickly you start to realize the only way the British and Canadian destroyers could be doing all they were doing is if they've modified their equipment for what they were supposed to officially have. And that's the other thing I haven't really touched on much of this. Very rarely do you find a destroyer or a torpedo boat or anything smaller than a destroyer, which is actually as it was listed as designed to be fitted. More often than not, their crews have modified them. They've added on extra weapons. And when I say extra weapons, I mean extra weapons. These crews will modify things. You will find entire... one of the things with radar, the big point with radar is it's not just the information of having the radar, it's how you display the information. Once you have the circular display screen that shows you where things are in relation to you, that makes a big difference. But to do that, you have to have the radar constantly circling around. That display plot system was only supposed to be fitted to the British destroyers at D-Day. The Canadian ones hadn't yet got it. Yet the Canadians at nighttime are maintaining perfect station in pitch black with no lights on while they're approaching the Germans in line abreast. And they say they're doing this by radar. But if you've got a radar which isn't rotating or displaying on a screen, it won't do it for you because you're in line and your radar's pointed forward and you're also maintaining contact with the enemy. You can't be doing that. So the radar has to be rotating, which means they have to have modified it and they have to have got the display. And I think part of that, again, is learning is Tartar had been involved at Salerno, and she's one of the vessels which is involved back in this 10th flotilla. She's one of the vessels back there. And I think, again, it's the passing on information, the experience of Salerno. We need to be able to do line abreast operations. We need to be able to do this to keep torpedo boats back, to keep these things back. Okay, how are we going to get this done? Well, we can use the radar for this, but it's only got this many boats in the flotilla, or actually this many destroyers in the flotilla that are fitted out this way. Okay, so we need to adapt them. And I'm fairly certain they were. And I had an interesting when I got to visit HMCS Hyder last year and actually got to see a Tribal class destroyer in real life for the first time. One of the things I learned very quickly with talking to the people who preserved her is the crews were just as ardent about modification as they were about acquiring enemy ships for the very nice finder's fees.
Right. So I've got a question for you, Alex, because in my head, the development amphibious landings is kind of linear in terms of the date. So, Torch, Husky, Avalanche, and then Neptune / Overlord. But I'm now thinking that actually it's not really linear. It's those three, the three previous ones, and there's others, of course, around the world as well. But Torch, Husky, and Avalanche, actually, it's more like three separate routes that each have a separate arrow down towards Overlord, because there's different. They're all very different types of amphibious operations.
Yes. You learn different things from each one, and I would say it's almost more of a cumulative than a linear. So a linear would be a straight line, and it's a cumulative learning. And also, you have to also factor in that Ramsay, he basically starts planning from the moment he conducts Dunkirk, from the moment he's conducted all the withdrawals. And the other joy about it, of course, Dunkirk is not the end. There's also the evacuations from Western France and all sorts of other things which go on, or which operations, which Ramsay's involved in and helps with planning in. That's one of the reasons why Somerville's called back to service, because he'd been removed from the Royal Navy because he was ill. And so he'd been called to service to actually assist the Ramsay, etc. And one of the things Ramsay starts doing is he starts learning early on. He sends people out to various staffs when they're doing operations. And he goes, what are they doing? Why are they doing this? And he changes and adapts it for his own. He considers it very beneficial when he gets Cunningham and Vian, because he's got two experienced commanders, one above him and one below him. So he's got someone who he can point at the enemy and will not back down. Vian will not back down. He will keep the fleet there. So at that point, and with the American commander, he has, Vian says, own remark on him is, it was good to be matched. I was matched by someone from the same fervor. And it's that sort of point. You've got two commanders who will not, no matter what happens with their forces, will not allow their forces to withdraw. They will cover and support the troops. So when Ramsay turns around to the Eisenhower and goes, we will support you, we will get you ashore, he knows that, because he knows Cunningham will give him the political backing with Churchill if Churchill starts going, oh, we're losing too many or anything like that. And he knows Vian will at no point go, oh, we need to give in. No. Vian withdrawing, giving in, that's not in my language. And it's the same with the American commander. So he's got these two commanders he can deploy forward. But he also has to go through all the information that's come through from the operations and goes, what works, what doesn't work. And what doesn't work very quickly appears to him is the stuff that you need more space for. So this is why, to an extent, Torch, it doesn't provide you useful information. It does provide some useful information for how to coordinate with the French, for how to do some of the SOE
Allied
stuff.
cooperation. Yeah.
It's good for that. It's not good for how you're going to conduct the actual operation.
Yeah.
And in many ways, Husky, again, you've got a lot of space to maneuver, but also the Germans were operating at a very distant logistics train. So in a way, Salerno becomes the far better learning point because it's confined waters. Okay, the channel's not as confined, but there's a lot more minefields and things, including Allied minefields. And one of the joys about the operation, the Battle of Ildebatz, etc., and the things I was talking about earlier with the destroyers, is that there had been a minefield supposedly laid by the Allies, which the Germans had gone straight through. When Ramsay found out the Germans had not even stopped, the minefield was that sparsely populated, they'd just gone straight through. He apparently had a long conversation, in the words of the commander of 10th Flotilla, with the officer, the rear admiral in charge of the mine-laying operation, which did not involve biscuits nor tea. Which, as Paul will know, and for those who are not British will know, basically means that's the worst conversation you can have with your boss. If there is no biscuits and no tea in that meeting and it's a long conversation, you're getting reamed.
Yeah.
You are.
I mean, not even a rich tea. Not even
nothing.
Which we've had a big debate about the rich tea not being a guest biscuit. We're going down a rabbit hole about it's a perfectly suitable solo biscuit, but it's not a guest biscuit. But if there's no biscuit at all on that, then things it's serious.
Yes,
that's no like starting the conversation with respect, sir. You know, prior to my previous, if I refer you to my previous email,
it's a case of there are no biscuits or tea served in this meeting.
Wow.
It's which, by the way, the reason 10th Flotilla knew it, the guy in 10th Flotilla knew that, was because one of his officers was dating Ramsay's senior writer, senior Wren writer. So she was outside the door while it was going on.
Wow.
Oh, it's fun.
We're just having a conversation. If it was me, you, and Drakeny fell together, the rabbit hole would be a disturbance in the force of YouTube. It would be some never-ending loop of conversation that doesn't ever end.
That is the potential sometimes.
But just to bring it back to a serious note again, because I think we agree that Torch probably is where the Allies learn how to do international cooperation. That's where relationships are strained about the politics of the empire and future and things like that, and Roosevelt and Churchill. And yet we get through that. We get through that sort of okay. And Husky kind of builds on that. You also made that point earlier about the fact with the fleet carriers and that is that we're also learning from Salerno what to do in the other hemispheres, Indian Ocean, the other side of the world as well, because personnel and ships go down that direction.
Well, one of the things is often one of the greatest operations which is never done is the British plan amphibious landings for Singapore.
Yeah,
and the retake of Singapore. And that is actually, if you look at some of the plans for that, that would have been an absolutely beautifully scripted operation. It would have been overwhelming. And that's basically the product of all the British knowledge on amphibious warfare going into this operation, which was going to involve Australian troops, Indian troops, and British troops doing a massive operation, which would have been combined with the forces coming down through Malaya, etc. They would have combined together and then pushed up. And their plan was to go, once they had Singapore, to carry on leapfrogging around the coast and just take the Japanese out and take back Vietnam and push up and bring in the Free French and link up with the Chinese forces up the coast. And their whole plan was actually, the British idea was if you did that and kept doing that, then if the nuclear bombs failed, you could secure a base close enough to Japan, probably high way, that you could operate pretty much a blockade from. And then you could work out whether you were going to do an amphibious assault on Japan, which was what the Americans thought was necessary because they wanted the war over, or you could do a longer-term blockade and starve to death of Japan, which was basically what the British were sort of in favor of.
Because final question, and we'll try and keep it brief. So obviously there were lessons taken from this that were taken to both ETO, Pacific, but based on the fact that there's the difficulty of a German air threat, there's the congestion in the water, there's the hastiness, frankly, that this plan was put together because it wasn't quite thrown together, but for the infantry elements, it was sort of maximum 45 days. So, if you had to give Avalanche in terms of the Navy aspect a score out of 10 for effectiveness, and I specifically mean judging it by not what can be learned to take the future, but on its own merits, what score out of 10 would you give it?
Considering it's thrown together just as quickly in terms of what can we grab from where we are, and the fact it delivers what it's going to deliver, I'd say it's an 8.
I thought you were going to say 7, but yeah, I mean, because Overlord should get a 9 or 10,
But the thing is with Overlord is that's got a lot of planning going into it.
2 years of planning and a huge amount of resources.
You should be looking at a good thing. So I have to say, you'd say a 7, but once you add in the fact of the speed at which it's thrown together, I think you'd be slightly generous in the marking and give them a bit of an 8. You're still giving them a first in academic terms, but
it is a transition. We did the show with Matthew Willis about the A-36. It's an aircraft that's not really doing what. It's not as effective as its job as an aircraft type would be a year or so later. The Navy are transitioning through various things. The Army are transitioning. So given that it's very much bridging the era of the war when we didn't have enough of everything and everything was a bit subpar to the latter part where we're getting better, I think it was, all things considered, pretty damn good.
The problem for the Royal Navy is that because of the Battle of Britain, etc., and because of war breaking out in 1939, their next generation of aircraft, which were all due to come in 1940, etc., were all pretty much stalled or cancelled or delayed. Or the Air Ministry said they had to have a different engine because they needed the engines for something else. And so this is why Royal Navy aircraft in the middle of war are just really terrible, because they're still using mostly their aircraft from the previous generation. Which was supposed to be retired by this point under their previous plan, and would have been retired other than you've got the Battle of Britain going on. So you can understand the logic to an extent. But that's one of the reasons why the American aircraft come in and are quite as good as they are, because they are that next generation. And it would have been, it's adapting into that sort of generation. Then it's jumping, using the American generation of aircraft and some transferred land-based aircraft transition to naval operations, that the Royal Navy then jumps into the next generation of aircraft after that. And again, when you're sort of looking at those coming in at the end of the British Pacific Fleet using them and what was planned for Operation Dragoon, Fireflies and all those would have been absolutely amazing, but they're just not available at this point. At this point, you have Supermarine Seafires. So good luck, as they're the first generation of Seafires. So really good luck.
Well, I mean, we're pretty much still at our first generation of M4 Shermans. I mean, there are some in North Africa and Tunisia, but it's still transitioning from the M3, the Lear, the Grant. And so everything in this stage in Italy is still really transitioning. You know, we're still working at the Allies how to use special forces. So commandos, Rangers, they're still going from that hit and run 1940-41 stuff to kind of the more regimental side things they do later on.
One of the interesting things again is sort of with the Salerno operation is the SBS. It's an interesting sort of the Royal Navy were using the SBS, and they'd been operating out of Malta with the U-class vessel, U-class, the 10th submarine flotilla. The Royal Navy loves things called the 10th flotilla or something. Those flotillas are often doing dangerous things, and the U-class. And this is one of the other next books which is going to be coming out from me, because I'm doing a book on the Flower class and a book on the U-class. They haven't been published yet, but they're going to be coming out at some point for me. And the SBS are just getting up to all sorts of nutty things up the Italian coast. The Salerno, the trouble is they're already involved doing Dodecanese jobs and all sorts of things in that area. So they're using troops forces which haven't been trained really for that role to do some of the missions which the SBS would do. And that's one of the issues we get with sort of the information coming in, because you get people who haven't done that information before. And then you look at D-Day, you look at what happens there in sort of Operation Overlord. They are landing specialists onto beaches to take detailed information from those beaches. That doesn't happen for Salerno. None of the preparations, even done for Husky, let alone Torch or D-Day, are done for Salerno. Salerno is, you've got the forces in transition, but you've also got the forces flying by the seat of their pants.
Yeah, no, exactly, and that that has basically been the overriding conclusion from this series, is that you know, all things considered, swiftness of planning, uncertainty. We know the Allies couldn't even really predict how the Germans were going to defend Italy, because the Germans hadn't decided themselves how they were going to defend it. So if they don't know, how the hell are we supposed to know?
It's a great way of avoiding your enemy working out what you're going to do, not knowing what you're going to do in the first place. You know, they can't predict you if you don't even know.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, and it's why, you know, the comparisons to Overlord, although valid, and we want to make them, because Overlords for most people is their frame of reference. That's the landing they know the most about. So everything else, including falsely comparing Dieppe and Jubilee to D-Day, which really just gets on my tits, there's no comparison at all, apart from they go from the sea to a bit of France. That's the only basic connection. But you know,
also Overlord, you have Mountbatten in charge of one. Let's be honest, compared to Ramsey, Mountbatten is no Ramsey. No, Mountbatten is not. Mountbatten has many strengths, I'm sure, somewhere, but planning and in-depth study and preparation are not them. You have to remember, Mountbatten started World War II as a destroyer flotilla commander alongside Vian. And they start off together, and quite at several points. The reason why Mountbatten's pulled away from destroyers is because Vian's flotillas keep getting called to go and pull his chestnuts out of the fire.
Yeah. Well, what's I've decided is we're going to just have to bring you back and just do a complete question and answer show, and just start with absolutely nothing, because there's so many people are saying there's so many potential things they've got in their minds to talk about, as I have. But it's been fun, as I knew it would be. So Alex,
and I do love that people keep talking about armored carriers. Jamie Seedale, who's also along with me and Drac, it takes part, of course, in the Bilge Pumps podcast when we have the time, which we do for SimSec, which is us looking at current affairs.
Yeah, no, Jamie's fantastic.
I have to recommend Jamie. He's great. He is mining my PhD shamelessly at certain points, but yes, he is great.
Well, there's some great people doing some great naval stuff, and I'm plowing my own, kind of trying to do a bit of everything. But Alex, it's been great talking to you. Good luck with everything, and we will plan something again. And folks, I'm back tomorrow evening for part 2 of Michael Ackerman's assessment of Les Moulins on Omaha Beach, and then I'm off for about 8 days, so you can go back and catch up all the old shows. So cheers, everybody. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Bye.
Thank you.